Thank you, Lisa, for your presentation. I'm very interested in the point of the artist slash researcher and the blurring of the boundaries. I just want to ask you what you think of, the idea of funding and the politics of funding for artists also to kind of explore their, to implement their projects and to research to undergo the research projects. And because I feel, I was thinking of, like shows like the MoMA in New York had a show on like Islamic art where, 17 different artists, were lumped into this category. And even though the projects explored, had research issues, there was this kind of curatorial kind of regime that enforced a certain agenda. So I don't know how, what you think of that also, and the curatorial politics and funding, and how it can influence kind of the research projects in the same way as some corporate conglomerates can influence the way information, journalists report on, certain issues.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm sure somebody who is a full-time, full-fledged artist could answer the question much better than I could. All I can tell you is you're exactly right that curators try to exert all kinds of control and influence over work and have a lot of power in terms of circulating or not circulating people's work. And they often, the way that funding sometimes works, the curator is able to parcel out monies, and does so at his or her discretion. I mean, there are some people here who are arts administrators and policy specialists or studying this field, right? Do you two have anything to add to that, or do you want to say anything about it? I think the arts funding is a huge category and a huge issue, and I mean, the basic thing is that there's not enough funding, but if you believe in making something out of nothing, which is what a lot of art is, ultimately, since it's so poorly funded, and I'm not saying it should be, that's something that you should just do.
Lisa, that was a wonderful presentation, and the way you use several resources and several a range of materials that you use in your research work is amazing. I mean, we all have to learn a lot from that. But my question is on this crisis of representation that we felt, long ago, a few decades ago. And in anthropology, of course, it has led to many debates, and that has led to a new style of writing, And we all are now sensitized about who is the author of the text, and and we all are asked to give voice to the people we talk to or we study. So after having, after taking these classes on ethics of authorship, how do we engage with creative practices as researchers? Is there a conflict between ethics of authorship and our engagement with creative activities or creative practices in our research? Because I saw that, especially the phrase that you are rearranging the visuals, you are rearranging the images, yeah? So there's a very strong voice of the researcher, The agency of the researcher is very, very strong there, even in the films that we saw. There's a very strong voiceover, and the text is written by the filmmaker in some sense. So I was just wondering, how do we engage with creative practices without messing up with the ethics of authorship?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. Yeah, I think the art that I tend to gravitate to and learn from does have a pretty explicit activist dimension to it, so that the artists in some cases are working in collaboration in the process of doing their research and investigating, trying to really collaborate in the research stage of their work with the people whom they're trying to investigate or describe or account for in terms of the working conditions. I think a lot of the people who do this kind of work in the arts have read the literature, the critiques of Western anthropology, and the ideas about ethnography, and the necessity of the reflexivity on the part of the position of the artist, researcher, ethnographer, however you want to formulate that. But that never goes away. I mean, it's not that we can ever entirely work through that. I think flagging it and using it as points of discussion and points of evaluation of artwork and research is just the best we can do, because we've inherited a set of conditions historically that create these kinds of tensions, and maybe the work is best when those tensions do emerge. You know, if they're not there, then maybe we should be worried. But I think your question is an excellent one, and it's something that I'm thinking about a lot. I mean, there are also a lot of issues regarding cultural competency, language issues, whether one has deep enough knowledge of the historical circumstances of a people and a place, and understands the political and economic systems in adequate terms in order to be able to make statements about that situation. So those are the kinds of things I think about a lot.
Okay, we've got two people holding mics here, then Lisa.
Just to follow up on the question, on the issue of curatorial power, and a question to you. Actually, over lunch, I talked with these two ladies about this already. I'm a comparative literature and cultural studies scholar from Taiwan, but I was seconded to the Taipei city government as director of the cultural department for 3 years and 9 months. And I have encountered actually a plethora of interesting and sometimes agonizing experiences. And among them was this project that we initiated with a very radical NGO group over a site of unregulated constructions, which were originally planned. Originally was to be demolished by the government, and with the people all evacuated, and then turned into a park. But we managed to. Back then, I was still a scholar. You know, I as a scholar with this NGO group and the cultural department, we managed to kind of rescue that site from being demolished and turn it into a sort of historical legacy site. And so after I became the director, we initiated this project of renovating the site with kind of minimal intervention, minimal change of the site, only sort of improving the living conditions a little bit. And also by turning it into a place where people can have access to that place, so that, you know, so to speak, you know, that you know, ordinary citizens can learn from this community. Yeah. But then, in the process of doing this, we also initiated a project by inviting kind of avant-garde artists to have residence there, to interact with the people living there, in order to kind of to see how it works, you know, whether or not in the future it could be turned partly into a artist village where artists could interact and kind of do service to the people there. But then toward the end of my tenure as the director, you know, these avant-garde artists turned against us, turned against both the government and the other radical NGO group, which were, you know, devoted to urban regeneration. And in the end, after I left, you know, the city government had to use police force to, you know, drag them out. Yeah, it was very sad, you know. Unfortunately, it didn't happen when I was there. But what's even more interesting is that the Fine Arts Museum, Taipei Fine Arts Museum, was under administration. The museum invited a curator who invited an artist who actually, among the artists who actually instigated the whole thing, the rebellion against the culture department. The curator invited him to present a work at the Venice Biennale, which kind of documented the whole thing, you know. But you know, but back then, as a director of the department, I mean, I knew every detail, so I was not very happy with this decision of the curator. But then, as a scholar, you know, I thought, you know, it was best for them to just go ahead and do what they wanted to do. I could only somehow, you know, negotiate with them as a scholar when I left the department. So I'm going to present this paper at in England very soon at the Cultural Citizenship Conference. But you know, all I want to say is that it's when you're inside, you know, you see things, and then it's not very easy. It's not that simple that, you know, people, artists, avant-gardists who are against the government are necessarily justified in what they're doing. You know? And the question that I have for you is that you have, I think you have listed 3 points, kind of like a conclusion to your talk, right? Like, for instance, I think you said the creative industry should be examined as a relational cross-sector thing, and should be examined in its historical context, and infrastructure reform as a precondition for whatever. But it seems to me that there's no obvious relationship between this conclusion to what you talked about. I was wondering how you
Well, I tried to
came
make,
to that.
I made a demarcation between like the kind of art research that I was trying to present, and then trying to think about the 2 films that I showed, and how, you know, how can humanities and art collaborations contribute at this particular moment where news media are bought out by corporations, and we need news about what's happening in the world more than ever, and we especially need to understand in much greater depth what globalization means across different parts of the world and across different sites. So that's, I was kind of just trying to, I wasn't necessarily concluding, I was just marking out 3 things that I thought could be important to think about, and not saying that it was a revolutionary novel point, but just trying to bring it back to the notion of creative industries and how we might think about these issues.
Lisa, I wanted to say that the talk today was a great way of sort of furthering my own understanding of what you do. And what's particularly amazing is the really sciencey stuff you work on. So what I was wondering about was, I mean, particularly I was thinking about, especially dealing with these kinds of technologies like satellites and other things, which, as you correctly said, are very sort of under the radar, metaphorically speaking. Like, just to learn about the kinds of things that actually then become the focus of your work, like footprints, et cetera. I mean, I was just wondering what kind, and I was thinking of other technologies where we come to learn, like the public comes to learn about them because of whistleblowers on the inside. And I'm just wondering if you've given a thought to the role of whistleblowers in opening up, you know, opportunities for artists and art research on these kinds of things, just to sort of reveal what's actually going on. Are whistleblowers important to that process?
You mean
Like, I'm thinking, like,
whistleblowers apart that are distinct from artists?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking, I mean, the ones that came to mind were, I mean, I was just thinking about, like, who are not artists, but whose whistleblowing reveals things about industries that then lend themselves, as you said, then to understanding it through art. And like Karen Silkwood, Mordecai Vanunu, whoever blew the lid on domestic spying. Like, I mean, just sort of the role of people inside, who are actually in the industries, who have to then make it possible to research it.
I think a lot of, you know, artists, I mean, I think some of you may know Trevor Paglin's work, where he published a book called Torture Taxi. After he's a geography from UC Berkeley who was spending time doing some research out in the desert in the middle of nowhere, and saw chartered planes landing on landing strips and had ways of documenting and investigating where these planes were coming from by looking at FAA flight path data, and ended up finding out that these were the CIA chartered flights that were used to move terrorist suspects around. And he's an artist. I mean, he has a PhD in geography, but he's somebody who's interested in, I mean, his work focuses a lot on secrecy and trying to find ways of making secret military projects intelligible to the public. But so I mean, I think the work of whistleblowers is crucially important, and we could think of it as a catalyst for some art investigations and arts research as well. And that artists in some cases might also be whistleblowers.
I'll be real quick. You said something about wanting to make your art a little bit messier. And I totally get the impulse. But on the other hand, I'm thinking of artists like Chris Jordan or Edward Rutinsky who make these monumental and very neat, very precise aesthetic objects, but in response to things like waste or industrial recycling in China or something. And it's that tension between the aesthetic, and you could almost call it the anesthetic, the just utterly everyday, the ordinary, the hopelessly dull, or the locationally messy. And that, you know, it's kind of a Robert Smithson sight, non-sight idea that your friend Lisa Beeman, I guess, Ursula Beeman, talks about briefly in her video, you know. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know that making it messier is necessarily going to make it, you know, more real or anything like that. I think sometimes it's the artificiality that is the reality effect in an odd way.
Yeah, I think what I was getting at is just recognizing the disjuncture from having moved through areas that were crumbled to the ground on the one hand, and seeing that in some of the images, and then the antiseptic space of the gallery and the orderly way of presenting and representing that historical event that was much more unwieldy. So when I presented it in this format, that just jumped out to me in a way that I had never really saw it that way before. So that's kind of what I was getting at.
Hi, my statement's kind of related to that actually, and I really appreciated that sort of end formula you put on the screen about the sort of the kind of critical impotence, if you will, of the sort of mainstream media giving way to this space that can be filled potentially by artists. And I would say that that definitely sort of cuts across different sort of practices. One could easily situate the blogosphere in that sort of space, and I'm actually, that's the thing that I'm kind of interested in, are those categories. And I think it was really key yesterday actually when we saw the film last night that you made an effort to say that Ursula considers herself a video essayist, while David considers himself to be a documentarian. And I'm trying to sort of unpack those kind of two categories, and just from in my experience of sort of knowing both kinds of practitioners, the video essayist sort of considers the documentarian's work to be kind of flat-footed, reductive, what have you, while the documentarian considers the video essayist's work to be pretentious, not enough in the trenches, as it were. And the video essayist would, I'm sorry, is it not? Sorry. Okay. And the video, I mean, and I'm speaking in general terms, but the video essayist would tend to show the work in art institutions, not, sort of poo-poo like the idea of putting the full video on YouTube, whereas a documentarian may say, screw it, let's put the thing on YouTube. And so I'm just trying to understand the sort of efficacy of the video essayist versus in the pursuit of, this space that we feel is critically needed to be filled in terms of getting information out there, kind of thing.
Okay. I think you formulated the question really well. I don't know if I have a lot to add to it other than just to say that, I think Ursula really was socialized into video in a way that made her really committed to thinking about how to write critically with video. And I think she identifies herself that way because that's what all of her projects do. And I think she reads a lot of cultural theory and feminist theory. So she sees it as a form of writing, maybe more as much as a practice of documentation. And, you know, she's quite reflexive in the process of presenting these different kind of compartmentalized files to us. And, but it's a really good question, I think, to just think about, and which kinds of projects would fit in either category.
Okay, just two more questions. One back wall and then one at the table, and we're done.
Before that, I just want to say, keep your eyes peeled, though, for David Redman's new documentary. He's working on a project about the maquilladoras across the border in Mexico and Victoria's Secret bras, which should be a really interesting project. I know he and his partner have been working on this, and they've got information about it on their website. But it could be, yeah. I mean, there are other projects. There's also this project about Juarez by, this Lores Portilla. Yeah, this one. Yeah. In any case, sorry to interrupt.
No, that's all right. I was just wondering if maybe it's something that I picked up on, because when I first saw this image, I was thinking, you know, this is like a caribou's antler bleeding in this. But there's something that that is different in the methodology of your presentation and your art projects that I think is very different from the methodology of at least the documentary we just saw, and that your denaturalization or defetishization of technology has a lot to do with renaturing, literally unplugging and bringing it down to nature, or literally shooting it down into grounding it or submerging it in water, or regrounding it in the tundra or the rural areas. And there's something you know, really sensual and really interesting about the way that your particular methodology doesn't just resituate it into labor, but resituates it into non-human labor and whatever natural forms of production. And just wondering how you think about that methodologically, and how you just mark your specialness, you know, in relations to these other methods, or if you think about that at all.
Do you use translators?
Yeah.
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 The process is, you know, because you go into very different areas, and I'm not assuming you speak all these different languages,
No.
for example. Right?
I speak Slovenian and a tiny bit of Serbo-Croatian. I learned Slovenian while I was there. I had to, for part of the grant money, I took classes and that. But I tried to get some CDs of Mongolian and a book, and the transliteration really messed me up. I mean, it's a really difficult language to learn. And so, yeah, if I write a grant application for a research project, I put a whole category for translation, and I get as much money as I can for translators, because their work is, could be a whole 2-week seminar at least. That, you know, lots of people in humanities are working on these translation issues. It's a very complicated issue, and also just as a labor question, translation is a huge, interesting issue. So I do, in order to try to investigate the way that media systems or infrastructures are being operationalized across different sites, I'm moving through territories where people speak different languages, and I do have to hire translators. And I'm kind of interested in more, and maybe I'll bring this up a little bit more tomorrow since we're kind of running along on time, but I'm interested in fringe areas and the outskirts and the rural areas and the peripheries. That's where I tend to do my research more than the centers and the places where a lot of urbanization has already taken place. And so I'm interested in, when you get out to where the cable ends, how the world is different on either side of that infrastructure. And I didn't really think about that until after finishing this post-war footprints project, and then I did a project in California about the end of the cable system in the desert and on the ocean, and then trying to think about whether these infrastructures really end there, or is that where the satellite picks up and takes off. The work in terms of working in more remote and rural areas has led to thinking about media in relation to natural resources and territory and atmospherics more than just as kind of narratives, texts, and frames. So, and the work of Anna McCarthy at NYU has also been really helpful and influential to me, where she started investigating television in public spaces and thinking about its ambient effects as a kind of atmospheric effect rather than something that's always kind of anchored within the frame and within the living room and within the studio. So trying to develop critical models where we can think about media technologies in more territorial and atmospheric ways. And now I need to better understand the electromagnetic spectrum. That's where I'm at.
Last question.
Yeah, I was wondering, and well, first of all, thanks so much for your presentation. Yeah, I found it quite inspiring. I have a question about the Stephen Johnson article, because I remember reading it a couple of years ago, and what I thought struck me as odd about it is that he was kind of sort of talking about the problems with mainstream media, and then he seemed, and then he talked about art as being able to do what mainstream media could not. But he also, what I thought was very strange about it was he didn't really mention alternative media. Like, he didn't talk about like the whole citizen journalist phenomenon. He didn't talk about YouTube or indie media or Democracy Now! Or anything like that. And so I thought it was odd that that seemed to be, like, he didn't mention that in the article. And as well, okay, like, it was a couple of years ago when I read it, but I also remember the examples of art. He was talking mainly about Documenta 11, and it seemed kind of quite institutionalized. And so I kept wondering about the politics of distribution and where was the grassroots. And especially in terms of who sees work and who participates in it, and how it's distributed. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point in response to his piece. That and maybe given the history of public broadcasting and public media in Europe and the erosion of those systems, the corporatization of public broadcasting in Europe has just made him more panicked than to look at the way that the internet has offered alternative sources of news. I don't know why he neglected to deal with that issue, but it's great that you brought it up. I think it's a really good point you make.